Thank you to everyone this week who has reached out. We have had an explosion of comments and messages come through this week. Really appreciate you sending these through. I know there's a lot of questions to get through. I have been trying to respond where I can. But in the meantime, we obviously need to try and get some of these answered in this session. Now, before I start, for all of my London compadres, I will be at London Tech Week in June. Feel free to reach out. Let me know if you're around. I'd love to connect with you. Also, if anyone's interested, I am presenting at the Corporality Summit on May 17th to 19th. I will be there on May 18th presenting. So feel free to reach out. I have got some last minute tickets if you'd like to join, and I'm happy to give you the code. Otherwise, I would love to see you there. Now, we have had several questions come about around my cloud infrastructure. I don't know if it's secure. I'm not sure how do I monitor it. I don't know if identity is being tracked. And in fact, we start getting stuck in a myriad of acronyms, especially in IT. How surprising, we have a ton of acronyms around what we would talk about in that environment. So today, without further ado, I have a special guest in Frank Yoo joining me. Frank, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time.
No, thank you for your time as well, Kristof. Glad to be here.
Mate, pleasure. Now, you and I spoke off camera about quite a few of these questions that came through, hence I raised it and I thought, look, you'd be the right guy to talk about. Mostly because I've had 1,000 people ask, and I say that without tongue in cheek, a ton of acronyms: CIEM, CNAPP, CSPM, and then we start talking about PAM, we start talking about identity management, acronyms galore. And this is probably something that is enough to make most people, even on IT, go and roll their eyes. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, I definitely an interesting one. I mean, even CNAPP is well, I think a lot of people will call it CNAPP these days. So it's not even just the acronyms. I think there's a lot of tongue twisting words, like you sort of mentioned, that's coming through as well in the industry.
Yeah, no, and totally. And look, I mean, we're covering these off specifically because, as an example, we attended the AWS Summit only a couple of weeks ago, right? And when we were talking with some of our partners and colleagues, the whole concept came up around PAM, right? So PAM is a very simple term that has been around for a long time. And the reason being is because it's been used across infrastructure, both on-premise as well as in the cloud. Now, we're talking about privileged access management. That's probably one of the easier baselines to start from. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah, and I think it is. I mean, we've come from the world where, things were on premises. Obviously, you had your servers, your storage, and all of the wealthy world of operating systems and everything else that lands between the application and so forth. And of course, as you sort of mentioned, PAM, or privileged access management, was a core component to making sure that you have the right level of access control to any of these individual applications or the systems that you are managing on premises.
Yeah, and look, it's an interesting cousin to IAM, obviously. So, identity access management. So they're very different in regards to what they do as an individual, especially service. When we talk about identity management, we're talking about a broader end user in scale as well. And we start talking about actually being able to identify the person who's coming in and the privileges that are allocated. When we're talking about privileged access management, we go in a bit more detail around high-level administrative privileges. So, I mean, there is obviously a similarity in regards to them. But then let's take that. You said that quite identifiably, where we go from on-prem into the cloud. Now, this is probably the biggest move we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years, excluding hypervisors. I mean, obviously, hypervisors was probably a big thing, but that was the precursor for cloud movement. Now, we've talked about this, and then we start to talk about workloads shifting. And I spoke to a previous colleague of mine, Phoebe Go, around this, was around workload movement, right? And this is the thing that people don't understand. It's not just infrastructure, it's workloads that we start to need to focus on. And that's when we take that next native level above, right? And you talked about CNAPP, for example, where moving it, lift and shifting it, I think is probably the most appropriate term, into the cloud doesn't give you that security straight up, right? By default, there is a bit of an assumption that when you're in the cloud, your infrastructure is secured and managed. What's the next level to take when we start talking about this? And how do we then take that conversation from, oh, it's in there now, what do I need to worry about?
Yeah, and a very good question, Kristof. I mean, again, if we use the same comparison that we had between the on-prem world versus the cloud world today, everybody's sort of number one remit to securing applications and systems on premises was really that, again, the privileged escalation or that network perimeter, if that makes sense. Whereas one of the things that a lot of organizations are starting to now realize as they start to migrate a lot of their critical infrastructure, the critical applications to the cloud, is that the old world of protecting what's behind the firewall no longer applies in the cloud world. To give you an example, again, like you've sort of mentioned, identity. So identity isn't just about users or the humans who are actually accessing the systems, but even individual resources that you procure inside, let's say, a CSP, like an Amazon or an Azure or a GCP, they have their own identities on its own. Otherwise, how would you be able to access the storage service that exists in AWS versus how do you then access the database service that exists on Azure? And so this whole complex level of, I guess, let's call it policies that exist inside these CSPs mandates that you need a different way of protecting that perimeter for those individual resources that exist in the cloud. And hence why this whole new term, and again, yet another acronym called IAM or Identity Access Management, has now sprung about into the industry that really defines, well, we used to have this privileged access management where it was between, let's say, one human to a system. We used to have firewalls to protect effectively the perimeter of your data centers from any intrusions from, again, a human to a particular organization system. But now, as we start to enter the cloud world, because of this complex policies that are intertwined between all of the services and also even for the humans who are accessing the cloud systems themselves, there needs to be a new approach in terms of, what are we really protecting here? Are we protecting still the perimeter, or are we now starting to look at protecting the individual resources should, let's say, a resource does get compromised, by a certain anomalous attacker that's out there in the wild, trying to steal any of your sensitive information, which typically seems to be the goal these days for most of the organizations as we go forward. So this whole new concept of IAM, which again contains identities, it also contains a lot of the policies and also other policies intertwined with other policies to then be able to provide effectively a service that can be delivered to your customers and or your end users, really means that the level of discovery that we need to look into changes fundamentally to not only just the humans that are interacting with the systems, but we need to be able to understand what are these policies really defined for? How are they accessing the individual services? And how does that also allow someone else, maybe even someone outside of your organization, be allowed to access any of the resources that you have inside your cloud accounts as well?
So interesting point you made there. Just so clarification of the audience, CSP stands for Cloud Service Provider. So there are, if we're talking about CSPs, we are talking about, including, for example, ourselves, but we are talking about public cloud providers in this particular instance because we are talking about GCP, Google Cloud, for example, Amazon, which is probably the standard which we appreciate started from Amazon Web Services, and of course, Microsoft Azure. Now, you've talked about quite a few little, let's call it intricacies, especially around the services and around securing that. And we've talked literally briefly touched around infrastructure, right? And you're right, the perimeter that used to be on premises, probably a little bit more easy to engage where you had that front level support. Now, when we start to talk about moving into a CSP of sorts, we have various perimeters. We're talking both internally, externally, as well as internet facing. When we start to identify that, so how do we get an idea of who shouldn't, have access to these environments? And we talk about, I'll give you a prime example. We were engaged on a consultative engagement to have a look at an AWS environment, and we found the AWS root key was the standard ClearPass and was internet accessible. So that being the case, what is it? Are we talking about, cloud infrastructure entitlement management? Is that where we start to talk about CIEM or from a different version, CIEM, not the other version, which is Security Incident Event Management?
Yeah, and it's a very good question as well. I mean, typically with most organizations, they start off with the basics, right? I mean, we've done the same thing, 15, 20 years ago with our Unix systems, our Windows systems. There were hardening guides to make sure that you protect the individual systems that are running on premises. In the cloud world, obviously, there are different metrics around how we go and protect those. So we start obviously with the basics. And of course, there is a long list of checkboxes, if you will, to
Laundry list, let's call it.
yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we have this long list of checkboxes that allows you to at least have the bases covered. What we don't understand, and with most of the typical customers that we speak to today, what they don't understand is, what goes beyond that single resource that you have configured. And again, coming back to that whole concept around multiple policies that are intertwining inside a cloud service provider, the ability for you to really understand what's really there, as well as protecting the basics, really needs to become the standard as you start to really protect that whole cloud infrastructure that you have under your management within your organization. And that's really where that CIEM, or Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, really comes into play. Because again, when we start to look at, we're ticking all the boxes, but we're still getting, attacked, or maybe there are still some of the data breach, again, news that we're still seeing in the industry today. I mean, I think, there was roughly about 36 or 37 and still counting issues that we've seen over the last, or news that we've seen over the last 9 months or so. But the reason why we're not really getting into the weeds, or we're not understanding where this is all coming from, or we're not able to detect or respond to any of those incidents, is because we're only going by the books of what the checklist is telling us. We're not fundamentally looking at the again, the dark information that exists in the cloud world, because we fundamentally don't understand what that obviously means, when we just look at it from a pure brick and mortar perspective.
Let's take that a little bit, a step back briefly. When we talk about cross-functional skills, we have definitely got growth to happen when you move into the cloud, and I absolutely appreciate that. Obviously there's some areas of that. One of the key fundamentals we see about this, especially when it comes to security, is about visibility, right? And we've talked about what you know and what you can see, you can react to. And it's the same as leaving your front door unlocked, for example, at home. You may have the best doors, they may be 3 mil deep, and then you've accidentally left the lock open. So when we start to talk about visibility, if that crucial, this is probably the most crucial part of it. How do we get some more visibility? I mean, is that what we need to see so that we can then do some automated workflows behind that and go, guys, girls, whatever it is, have you left a backdoor accidentally open, or has someone left the organization and that still has principal control over certain elements?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Like you've sort of mentioned, Kristof. I mean, again, these days, a lock isn't really enough for anybody to even enter through your front door. I mean, there's obviously, multiple ways that people now engage in, such activities, if you will. But the cloud world is exactly the same. It's not just the principal users who are using the cloud. But again, if I take maybe one of the recent cases that we've seen, at least here in Australia, you start to realize a compromised resource in the cloud can also become the back door for someone to be able to again retrieve and/or download any of that sensitive information that the organization wants to make sure that it's hidden away. So again, the visibility is really the key component for us to be able to really understand, well, where are my risks? Where am I starting to see those gaps? How do I identify those gaps? Because to your point, without understanding what's really underneath those simple applications that we consume on a day-to-day basis, there is really no other way for us to be able to determine whether it is a risk or a security issue to that organization or to even an individual.
Yeah, and look, I mean, one of the key factors is that whole up to date and real time, even. Right? One of the worst things I've seen, and I say that tongue in cheek worst, but when we see these sort of reports, they're jumped out once a week. For example, if you've got a user access report that we can be generated by the CSPs, you can have that generated on a regular basis. Now, the concern I have around that is obviously there is time between the report and then time between potential breaches. And that in itself can be something interesting, because if you start looking from a, let's call it a radial blast, sort of when it comes to these sort of things, visibility only happens at a certain point in time where it disappears, because cyber criminals are clever enough these days, especially, to hide their tracks once they're in. And, credit to them, that's something that's obviously going to be a concern for us. So when we get this visibility, being reactive is one thing. How do we then make that something that we can create automation behind to then go, okay, let's be careful. We're going to pause this activity just until we know more about it.
Yeah, and it's a challenging question for everybody. I guess the number one thing that I'd like to highlight based on your comments is, again, the cloud world is so agile, it's so scalable and elastic. You're right. I mean, having a daily report or even a monthly report or even an hourly report is just not enough. So that continuous monitoring is something that is required, especially in the cloud world. But one of the things that's also coming up quite frequently these days, and you mentioned reactive to preventative, if you will, reactive being more of solving what's already there, what's already being provisioned. Let's then go and remediate the security gaps to ensure that we mature our cyber hygiene. But at the same time, equally important is a preventative approach. And one of the trends that we're starting to see, especially with a lot of the customers or the prospects that we talk to today, and even in the consulting world, is, again, to your point, you mentioned automation. It's really around that IAC, or the infrastructure as a code, that's really coming in. So the ability for you to literally be able to spin up an entire environment in less than a couple of minutes by a click of a button, or by changing or modifying that environment by a single, a change to the Terraform code or the automation code that you may be using to provision these environments. So one of the key components to having that preventative security, I guess, posture, if you will, or a much more mature security posture by having that preventative measure, is by injecting yourselves in between that automation step, if you will. So before any of the resources does get committed to the cloud, before any of the resources are generated inside any of your Amazon, Azure, or GCP, is really key to being that sort of preventative measure, as well as importantly as trying to remediate any of the existing infrastructure that you already have inside your environment as well.
Yeah, and look, and that's going to be one of the key factors. I mean, especially when you're talking about workload transformations and digital transformations, you will see quite a lot of that. Prime example will be someone shifting their workloads within the CSPs. Then, as part of that, doing a transformation to obviously get greater efficiencies. That's probably not the most idyllic scenario, because you'd want to transform before you shift. Nonetheless, it has happened. Obviously there are incentives from the CSPs to actually get you on board, and therefore, you're given those commercial rebates. In which case, what happens is, and we've seen this, is there are applications that get migrated and mitigated, and obviously there are potential gaps during that migration period where certain accounts that are set up by default, for example, administrative accounts, are still left open and exposed. So, that whole concept of application level, and this is probably the next level, is how do we then get down to that application so that we can get into it and see the nuances, so that when we start to get, those transformations happening, the CISO can sleep at night, because he's not sitting there going, these guys are transformed and I haven't seen what the actual activity report looks like, and I haven't gone through and haven't seen that identity access management change.
Yeah, and that's where I think that blast radius that you sort of mentioned really comes into play. I mean, understanding and having a tool that really helps you be able to do that right level of visibility, doing the right analysis based upon industry standards, as well as having a little bit of, I guess, AI or ML behind it to really be able to understand the behaviors of these individual either infrastructure resources or the applications really means that then you really have the ability to understand, should an application, should a resource does get compromised, what does that look like from an impact radius perspective or a blast radius perspective? And I think the key component to this is, again, and you sort of mentioned CISOs, but for any of the CX levels or the CXO levels, understanding what risks are by having an application migrated to the cloud really then helps them understand, right, okay, well, these are the next steps that we need to take. These are the things that we need to make sure that we, I guess, close the loop on from a security gap perspective. That way, they obviously have that pleasure of, or the luxury of, being able to sleep well at night, knowing that they understand effectively where that risk lies and what that risk looks like by having that application migrated to the cloud or recreated in the cloud.
I appreciate that insight, Frank. Obviously, we're running out of time. Just wanted to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining us, Frank. Guys and girls, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the comments below. Frank is available. I have actually included him in the links for the descriptions above, so feel free to check him out at both LinkedIn or alternative platforms. Last topic, last point. What would you leave with the audience when we start talking about cloud security? What is that last nugget of gold that you can leave with us?
Sure. What you see is not everything, is probably my advice to everybody who's talking about or thinking about even cloud security. Again, the list of checkboxes is probably not enough for you to be protected from a cloud security perspective. There needs to be a way to look beyond what you see on the surface. That'll be my comment.
Perfect. Thank you again, Frank. Everybody also for joining us. Thank you to those who've commented. Vanessa, thank you so much. It was really appreciated. And all of your questions will be answered as soon as we're finished on this session below. As always, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to send them to both myself or Frank directly, and we will respond to you accordingly. Until we see you all next week, please be safe out there. There are boogeymen in the cyber world, and as I like to say, think before you click. Have an awesome weekend, everybody. Thanks again. Goodbye.